Sagittarius. The year she learned to rise from nothing. Have you ever lived through a moment so sharp, so sudden, that it didn't feel like something breaking? It felt like the ground quietly vanishing from beneath your feet? Camila remembered the exact second her life cracked open. A cold room. A stack of papers. A voice reading a decision that didn't tremble, even though her world did. After 20 years of devotion to the same company, 2 decades of early mornings and late nights, she listened as her name was paired with a sentence she had never imagined for herself. We're letting you go. Hello, Sagittarius. Tonight I want to walk with you into a story that may feel uncomfortably close. A story of collapse, of exhaustion, of the quiet courage it takes to rebuild a life when you thought your building years were done. Camila walked out of that meeting holding nothing but a box of old office memories, and the weight of a future she couldn't see. At 45, with a mortgage, a rusted car, a husband drowning in alcohol, and 2 children still needing everything from her, she felt the air tighten around her chest. The world didn't fall apart in chaos. It fell apart in silence. In the weeks that followed, she lived like a ghost in her own home. Bills piled quietly on the counter. Her husband drank. Her children watched her with the quiet fear kids have when they know something is wrong, but don't know how to name it. Camila kept moving, but she was barely alive inside. But here's the thing about Sagittarius souls. They break hard, but they rise differently. They do not return to who they were. They evolve into who they never imagined they could become. This is not a story about triumph. Not yet. This is a story about the turning point. The year Camila discovered that when everything is taken from you, what remains is truth. And sometimes truth is the fire that saves you. Map 1. The days when silence weighed on her chest, the quiet collapse. The morning after Camila received her termination papers felt unreal, like waking up inside someone else's life. The house was still the same, peeling paint near the window, the faint hum of the old refrigerator, the uneven rhythm of her husband snoring from the couch, but she felt different, as if her body had become too heavy for itself. When she poured coffee, her hands shook. When she looked at the kitchen table, she saw the mortgage bill lying there like it had been waiting for this exact moment. 20 years of loyalty reduced to a single signature. 20 years of waking before the sun to show up for a job that never imagined her absence could hurt her this much. She sank into the chair, staring blankly at the clock, listening to each second tick like a countdown she had no idea how to stop. The weight of a life she could no longer carry. When she drove to pick up her kids from school later that day, the old car squeaked and rattled over every bump, as if reminding her of everything that was wearing out at the same time she was. The children ran toward the car, backpacks bouncing, laughter bright and unaware. Camila forced a smile. She didn't want their eyes to know. That night, her husband came home smelling of alcohol again. He dropped onto the couch without asking how she was, without noticing how vacant her gaze had become. Maybe he didn't know how to notice anymore. Maybe she didn't either. The silence wrapped itself around her like a thick, heavy blanket. She lay awake long after everyone had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a life could unravel in a single afternoon. There was no anger yet, no bitterness, not even fear. Just numbness, a strange emotional vacuum where even pain had no space to land. Half a year of darkness. The days bled into each other, indistinguishable and dull. Camila moved through the house like a shadow. She cooked, cleaned, folded laundry, helped with homework, but she wasn't present in any of it. She was functioning, not living. Weeks turned into months and she found herself slipping into a quiet depression. The kind that does not announce itself dramatically but grows like mold in the corners of your life. She stopped answering calls from old coworkers. She avoided mirrors. She no longer wore makeup. She didn't dare open her laptop, afraid it would remind her of who she used to be. Some evenings, when the children were asleep and the neighborhood had fallen silent, she sat on the cold kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, her knees pulled to her chest, wondering how a person begins again at 45 when everything they've known is gone. The flicker that refused to die. But even in the thickest darkness, Sagittarius hearts have a strange way of keeping one ember alive. A stubborn ember. A quiet ember. The kind that refuses to extinguish, no matter how much life blows against it. One night, as she sat in the dim living room, scrolling aimlessly on her old phone, she stumbled upon a video of a woman her age talking about AI, how she'd lost her job too, how she had started learning new skills, how little by little she had rebuilt her life. Something inside Camila stirred. Not enough to ignite hope, but enough to make her sit up straighter. She watched the entire video. Then another. And another. A tiny thread of possibility tugged at her chest. It wasn't confidence. It wasn't clarity. It was something smaller, almost fragile, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't done yet. Map 2. The dreams that slipped between survival, the life she thought she was supposed to have. In the months that followed, Camila found herself drifting between exhaustion and a strange, aching longing for a life she believed she had already earned. There were mornings when she would stand in the bathroom, staring at her reflection, at the lines near her eyes, the tired curve of her mouth, and she imagined the version of herself she once thought she'd become. Confident, secure, respected at work, driving a better car, taking her children on vacations she had promised them but never delivered. Sometimes she would picture herself walking into the company office she had devoted her life to, still believing she belonged there, still believing loyalty meant safety. Instead, she was now a woman with no job, a mortgage she wasn't certain she could keep up with, and a marriage that felt more like a burden than a partnership. At night, when her children were asleep, she would open her old laptop, not to work, but to stare at the blank screen, as if somewhere inside those pixels existed the life she lost. She imagined what her coworkers were doing, if they missed her, if they even remembered her. That was the cruel part of losing a 20-year job. The world kept moving without her, but she remained frozen in the moment she was told she was no longer needed. And in that frozen space, she built an imagined version of what her life should have been. An idealized future that felt safer to cling to than the sharp edges of reality. The small hands that pulled her back to earth. Yet even when she slipped deepest into sorrow, life had a way of reaching for her through the smallest gestures. One evening, her daughter crawled into bed beside her and wrapped tiny arms around her waist without saying a word. Another day, her son left a note on the fridge written in messy handwriting. "Mom, you're strong. I know you'll figure this out." Those simple moments, quiet, unannounced, became the invisible threads holding her together. She didn't recognize them as hope, not yet, but they softened the darkness around her, the way candlelight softens the edges of a room. Sometimes, while folding clothes or making dinner, she imagined her children watching her years later, grown, confident, remembering their mother not for her sadness, but for her strength. This imagination wasn't denial, nor was it fantasy. It was her heart whispering that there was still someone in the future she wanted to become. She clung to that imagined woman, not because she believed in herself yet, but because she needed someone to believe in. And here an insight emerged quietly, like the faint warmth before sunrise. Camila wasn't holding on to who she was. She was clinging to who she hoped she could still become. Sometimes the future is easier to love than the present. The night her life tilted toward possibility. One night, after a long argument with her husband, his frustration fueled by alcohol, her exhaustion fueled by everything else, Camila locked herself in the bathroom, sank to the tiled floor, and pulled her knees to her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't have tears left. She simply breathed slowly, painfully, as though her lungs had forgotten how to expand. When she eventually came out, the house was silent. The lights were dim, and something compelled her to open her phone again. Perhaps the same ember from before, the ember that refused to die. She stumbled across another video about AI. A woman in her 50s who had lost everything, learned digital tools from scratch, and rebuilt her life through freelance work. The woman spoke with a calm, steady confidence that seemed to reach right through the screen. Camila replayed the video twice. Then she whispered into the quiet, "Maybe I can try too." She didn't say it with conviction. She said it the way someone whispers a prayer they don't fully believe in yet. But that whisper became a seed. The first steps into a world she never imagined. The next morning, while her husband was still asleep and the children were getting ready for school, Camila made a decision she hadn't made in months. She opened her laptop, not to stare blankly, not to mourn her old life, but to learn. She watched beginner tutorials on AI. She scribbled notes in a small notebook. She paused, rewound, watched again. Her mind felt slow, rusty, overwhelmed, like a machine starting up after years of stillness. But she kept going. At first she hid what she was doing. She didn't want anyone to see her fail. She didn't want to hear her husband's sarcastic comments or her own inner voice whispering she was too old, too tired, too late. But each night after everyone slept, she spent hours learning prompts, testing tools, creating things she never imagined she could create. Slowly, the numbness began to thin. The darkness began to loosen its grip. The world inside her began to shift, not dramatically but steadily. And here, the subtle insight glimmers underneath the story. Camila wasn't only learning a new skill. She was reconstructing her identity. She was proving to herself that she could still evolve, still adapt, still rise. She was loving the version of herself she was becoming. The beginnings of reinvention. 2 months later, she mustered the courage to take her first tiny freelance gig. Rewriting product descriptions using AI assistants. The pay was embarrassingly low, but the feeling of earning her own money again, however little, made her hands tremble with something she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. A small pride. A fragile pride. But pride nonetheless. Her husband noticed she was working late and drinking less. Her children noticed she was smiling more often. Life didn't improve magically. Bills still came. The car still rattled. Her husband still had bad days. But the energy in the house shifted. And the first person to shift was her. Map 3. The night she finally faced the whole truth. The rainstorm that pushed everything to the surface. It happened on a night thick with rain. One of those evenings where the world outside feels like it's collapsing in rhythm with everything you're trying to hold inside. Camila stood at the kitchen counter, washing dishes, her mind numb, her hands moving mechanically. The sound of raindrops pounding on the roof blended with the muffled roar of her husband's approaching footsteps. The door slammed open. He stumbled in, drenched, smelling of alcohol and resentment. It wasn't the first time. But that night, something in his eyes was different. More lost, more defeated, and something in her chest tightened. He started mumbling accusations, about money, about responsibility, about how everything had changed since she lost her job. Camila didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood there, water running over her hands, letting each word land like a dull bruise. The children peeked from the hallway, frightened. She caught their eyes and shook her head gently, telling them without words to go back to their room. Her husband's voice grew louder, angrier, fueled by fears he didn't know how to name. It was in that storm, external and internal, that the truth began to crack open. Not all at once. Not like an explosion. But like the first fracture in a wall that has been holding too much weight for too long. The moment her daughter's voice broke through. The shouting stopped only when their daughter appeared in the doorway, tears in her eyes, small hands trembling as she held onto the frame. "Dad, stop," she cried. "Please stop. You're scaring Mom." The man fell silent, shocked by his child's fear. And in that pause, thin but powerful, Camila saw her life from the outside. As if watching a film she had unknowingly starred in. It wasn't the chaos that broke her. It was the realization of how much her children had been carrying silently. As her husband collapsed onto the couch, overwhelmed by his own guilt and helplessness, Camila guided her daughter back toward the bedroom. She sat beside her, brushing her hair gently. Her son joined them, sitting on the floor, hugging his knees. "Mom," he whispered, his voice steady but shaking. "Please don't give up. We still need you. You can't disappear like this." Something inside Camila shattered. Not painfully but truthfully. The kind of break that lets the light in. She realized in that moment that she had been surviving, not living. That her children weren't just watching her struggle. They were waiting for her to rise. She hugged them both tightly, her heart beating with a mixture of fear and newfound clarity. The reflection that changed everything. Later that night, after the children slept and her husband snored softly on the couch, Camila walked into the bathroom with slow, heavy steps. The mirror in front of her was fogged from steam, but she could still see her reflection. The exhaustion etched in her face, the grief in her eyes, the remnants of a woman who had forgotten who she once was. She placed both hands on the edge of the sink and whispered to herself, "Is this really the life I want my children to remember?" The silence answered her. She turned on the tap, splashed cold water onto her face, then looked again, this time with the quiet determination of someone seeing herself honestly for the first time in a very long time. There was no dramatic music. No divine revelation. Just a single undeniable truth. No one was coming to save her. She had to save herself. And in that slow cinematic moment, her Sagittarius fire flickered back to life. Not proudly, not loudly, but stubbornly, the way flames cling to survival even in the wind. The beginning of the turning point. She walked into the living room, took her old laptop into her hands, and sat down with a posture that was unfamiliar to her. Upright, steady, almost defiant. She opened the browser and searched for AI courses again. She rewatched the videos she had seen before, but now with an intention that felt carved into her bones. Her mind was tired, her heart sore, her body drained, but something inside her had shifted permanently. She was no longer learning AI because she hoped life would magically get better. She was learning it because she refused to let her children's future depend on her despair. Because she refused to continue shrinking under the weight of a moment that had already taken enough from her. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, the hidden insight surfaced like a soft echo. Sometimes the truth we're most afraid to face is that we are stronger than the life that tried to break us. This was not the end of her struggle, but it was the end of her surrender. The tension didn't explode outward. It settled inward, reorganizing her spirit into something steadier, clearer, more alive. Camila didn't know the future. She didn't know if freelance would work, or if AI would carry her, or if her husband would change. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was choosing herself. And choosing herself would save everyone she loved. Map 4. The fire that only dies when she stops believing. Why a Sagittarius heart breaks harder than it shows. In the weeks after that stormy night, something inside Camila began to stir with a clarity she had long forgotten. She found herself waking earlier, sitting with her cup of coffee in the quiet of dawn, feeling the soft hum of a life she was slowly reclaiming. But beneath her newfound strength lived a deeper truth, one that belonged not only to her, but to every Sagittarius woman who has ever had the ground ripped away from beneath her feet. Sagittarius is known for optimism, fearlessness, independence. But what people forget is that Sag also feels deeply. So deeply that when life betrays them, the wound doesn't just bruise, it fractures something internal. The reason Camila had fallen into such darkness was not because she was weak. It was because she had built her entire identity around loyalty, competence, contribution. 20 years of service wasn't just a job. It was a mirror of her worth. When the company discarded her, she wasn't just unemployed. She was unrooted, unseen, unvalued. That is the quiet devastation Sagittarius rarely admits. When they lose the meaning they have poured their soul into, they lose themselves for a while. They don't shatter outwardly. They shatter inwardly. They don't ask for help, they disappear. They don't scream, they shrink. But even in their smallest, dimmest moments, a hidden ember remains. A stubborn belief that life is still calling them forward, even if they cannot hear the call yet. The inner mechanics of a Sagittarius collapse. As Camila worked late into the nights learning AI tools, her mind repaired itself in ways she wasn't consciously aware of. Slowly, patterns emerged. Patterns every Sagittarius walks through when life knocks them flat. Idealization. For months she had clung to the belief that the life she should have had was still waiting for her somewhere, as if losing her job was a cosmic error that would one day be corrected. Sagittarius tends to romanticize the life they envisioned, turning it into a paradise that blinds them to the reality they must face. Hope projection. In her darkest months, Camila kept waiting. Waiting for an opportunity to fall from the sky. Waiting for someone to recognize her worth. Waiting for a sign that everything would magically align again. Sagittarius often places hope outside themselves when they are wounded, believing the universe will fix what is broken. But the truth is, the universe waits for them to move first. Fear of truth. The hardest truth for her wasn't the job loss. It was realizing she had tied her entire sense of purpose to a company that let her go without hesitation. Sagittarius hates acknowledging when they've invested their heart in something unworthy. Feels like betrayal. Feels like foolishness. And so, instead of facing the truth, they retreat into silence, choosing light over illusion. But there is something sacred about Sagittarius pain. It eventually becomes fuel. The moment Camila looked in the mirror and saw her own exhaustion reflected back at her, she also saw something else, the faintest glimmer of her old fire. The part of her that once believed she could do anything. The part she feared she had lost. Sagittarius doesn't heal through comfort. They heal through revelation. Often painful, often sudden, often honest. Her healing didn't come from AI tutorials. It came from the moment she said, "I refuse to die in the place life abandoned me." The psychology of reinvention. Sagittarius women are wired for reinvention. They don't move on, they transform. They rebuild identities like architects rebuilding cities after storms. But the architecture of that transformation follows a precise emotional path. Pain, reflection, defiance, rebirth. Camila walked that path unconsciously. Pain made her collapse. Reflection made her see herself clearly. Defiance made her stand up. Rebirth made her choose a future she had never imagined. There were nights she found herself staring at her laptop screen, overwhelmed and afraid she was too old to learn something new. But something inside her, something unmistakably Sagittarius, kept whispering, "Keep going, keep going, keep going." The whisper didn't come from hope or confidence. It came from instinct. From the ancient fire Sagittarius carries, the fire that refuses to let them end where they once fell. And slowly, as freelance projects trickled in, tiny jobs, small payments, long hours, Camila began to trust herself again. Not the old self. Not the corporate self. But the self she had never met before. The woman who could adapt, invent, navigate new worlds, create opportunities from nothing but will and necessity. This is the most powerful truth about Sagittarius. Their second life is always braver than their first. The mirror turned toward the listener. Camila didn't just rebuild her income. She rebuilt her identity. She didn't just learn AI. She learned herself. Her story becomes a mirror now, reflecting not only her transformation but the inner landscape of anyone listening. Where are you still waiting for someone to save you? Where are you still clinging to a life that ended? Where are you still believing you have nothing left, when in truth you are standing at the beginning? Sagittarius rises when they finally understand that meaning is not found, it is made. Sagittarius heals when they realize that their fire was never the job, the marriage, the stability, it was always them. And Camila, 45 years old, with a tired body and a battered heart, discovered the most important truth of all. You can start again at any age. You can rebuild from nothing. You can become someone you've never been. And someone you were always meant to be. Map 5. Where Sagittarius rises from the ashes she thought would bury her, the life she began stitching back together. Months after she first opened those AI tutorials, Camila found herself living a life that didn't resemble her old one, yet felt strangely more aligned with who she truly was. Her mornings changed, no longer waking with dread, no longer dragging herself through routines that felt hollow. Instead, she rose with purpose, opening her laptop with a sense of quiet determination. She took small freelance projects, product descriptions, chatbot drafts, marketing rewrites. The payments were modest, but they carried a meaning her old paycheck never did. Proof that she could rebuild her life with her own hands. Her husband began to soften too. The night of the storm had shaken him, not just with guilt but with clarity. He started drinking less, then slowly took a job as a local driver. Steady, humble work that brought a little more stability into the home. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a movie ending. But it was real. And for the first time in years, they were growing in the same direction instead of apart. The children watched her with new eyes. Not the eyes of fear, but the eyes of admiration. They saw her typing late at night, learning new tools, sending work to clients she had never met. They saw her tired but hopeful, weary but alive. They felt the shift in the house. The air was lighter, the silence didn't suffocate, the nights didn't feel like cliffs anymore. Life wasn't fixed, but it was moving. And sometimes that's all a rebirth really is, movement. What a Sagittarius learns when she has nothing left. When Camila looked back over the year, she realized she had walked through the hardest lesson a Sagittarius can face. The loss of identity. Sagittarius ties meaning to everything. Their work, their relationships, their purpose. Losing a 20-year career didn't just take away her income. It took away the narrative she had lived inside. It took away the version of herself she recognized. But here's what she learned slowly, painfully, and then profoundly. Meaning can collapse. Purpose can die. But the self can be rebuilt. She learned that reinvention is not loud. It is not glamorous. It doesn't happen in big leaps. It happens in quiet moments. The decision to try again, the click of a new tutorial, the acceptance of a small gig, the willingness to see possibility where once there was only emptiness. She discovered that being 45 is not an ending. It's a frontier. A place where experience becomes fuel and resilience becomes the backbone of everything new. Sagittarius women often believe they must be strong from the start. But Camila learned she could be strong after breaking, maybe even stronger than before. And this is the hidden strength of her sign. Sagittarius doesn't rise because life is kind to them. Sagittarius rises because surrender has never been in their nature. The healing no one teaches you but life. Healing didn't look like fireworks for Camila. It looked like breathing again. It looked like making dinner without feeling the weight of the world pressing onto her shoulders. It looked like laughing with her son over a silly meme. It looked like her daughter hugging her and whispering, "You're doing amazing, Mom." Most importantly, healing looked like forgiveness. Not for the company that dismissed her, not for the husband who faltered, but for herself. For collapsing. For disappearing. For taking months to stand again. For being human. One night, as she sat at her desk finishing a project, she paused and whispered, "I didn't think I could make it out of that darkness." The room was quiet, her laptop screen glowing softly. And then she added, "But I did." This is where the mirror turns gently toward the listener. Maybe you've been where Camila was, buried under fear, staring at a future that felt empty, believing you were too old, too tired, too late. Maybe you're still there. Maybe you're trying to rebuild yourself from the smallest pieces, not knowing if it will be enough. Let this be your reminder. You don't need to become someone extraordinary. You just need to begin. A soft message for every Sagittarius listening. You don't owe the world perfection. You don't owe your past a lifetime of mourning. You don't owe your mistakes eternal punishment. You owe yourself one thing, a chance. A chance to begin again. A chance to learn something new. A chance to walk toward a life that feels true to you. Not the life you once planned, but the life that is calling you now. Sagittarius, your fire isn't gone. It isn't dim. It isn't broken. It's waiting for you to breathe on it again. Invitation to share your own beginning. Camila's story isn't just her own. It belongs to anyone who has ever touched the bottom and wondered if they had the strength to rise. If this story echoes your heart, even a little, I invite you to share your own moment, the moment you broke, or the moment you stood again, or even the moment you're still gathering your courage. Because healing grows in the spaces where honesty lives, and someone out there needs to know they're not alone.